All right, Larry Krueger here from the Pig and a Pickle Krug Show with a little 49er video. Steve Young went on with Rich Eisen, and they had a very interesting little dialogue about Brock Purdy and how he played against Green Bay. And, of course, we're brought to you by Pig and a Pickle, the best barbecue in all of Northern California. Check them out in Emeryville and Corte Madera. They're open 7 days a week from 11 a.m. till 8 p.m. or until they run out. And, of course, this video brought to you by Underdog Fantasy. Check the Underdog Fantasy link in the description and use that promo code Krug, and they will match you up to your first $100. Underdog Fantasy, proud sponsor of the Krug Show, and thanks to them for being a sponsor of our show. And we should also mention this week in Underdog Fantasy, I am going with Lamar Jackson, higher than 60.5 rushing yards. Nick Bolton of the Chiefs, higher than 8.5 tackles and assists combined. Roquan Smith of the Ravens, higher than 8 tackles and assists combined. Amon-Ra St. Brown, higher than a half a rushing or receiving touchdown. And Javon Hargrave, higher than a half sack. I think Hargrave gets Jared Goff and puts him on the turf at least once this weekend. Sunday evening or afternoon, I should say, at Levi's. All right, let's talk a little bit about Steve Young. He went on with Rich Eisen, and they had an interesting conversation. And it's like, it was the conversation started with kind of where do you place Brock Purdy? What do you make? What sense do you make of Brock Purdy and his success and his struggles? And obviously the 49ers getting ready to play the NFC Championship game. First, I'm going to let you listen to Steve. I thought he had a number of interesting points here. Here is Steve with Rich Eisen on The Rich Eisen Show.
Where do you place Brock Purdy in this conversation?
Well, there is the anomaly of somebody who is so incredibly efficient. And the efficiency mavens, that's the wrong word, but the efficiency aficionados are still in the game. They still have a place. But they need a lot of help around them to be able to kind of go up against those guys. And so I think that Brock, I would put Kirk Cousins, I would put there's the efficiency kind of aficionados that are Brock is amazing what he's accomplished this year. And he's going to, I don't know, I mean, next week's a big game, obviously, against the Lions, but getting into the Super Bowl in this era with those guys, with how he plays the game is, I tip my cap to him. I mean, there's some of the stats, what he was able to do from an efficiency perspective. You might be able to make the case that there hasn't been a more efficient quarterback in the history of the game, in how he played this year. For example, one of the stats that just was the most amazing thing I've ever heard in my life is that the 49ers lead the league in yards per attempt if you just took the passes from the line of scrimmage or behind. Rich.
Yeah.
Those are 100% completion percentage, almost.
Yeah.
With zero risk or with very low risk, you're leading the league in yards per attempt against everybody else in the league. And that just goes to show the innovation. What we haven't talked about is the innovation that that there are maybe, I'm going to say under 10 of the innovative minds that are out there calling plays and coming up with new ways to attack these open spaces in the NFL that have showed up maybe 5 or 6 years ago with the rule changes. And one of them, the most amazing innovative minds is Kyle Shanahan.
Well, I mean, in that respect, though, Steve, I mean, the end of the first half was a head scratcher with what they were doing with the play clock. It honestly looked like they were trying to play for a long field goal that was going to get blocked. I mean, it was one of those horror movies where you could sort of see it coming with your hands over your face. And then Purdy, he did turn it on in that last drive. There's no question about it.
What happened? He became Mr. Efficient. The ball came out. They made the completions. They made the plays. He did everything that you would want a Super Bowl quarterback to do in the key moments. And he's young. It's amazing. There's going to be a movie about him. There's going to have to be a movie about him at some point. And I've interviewed him and know him, and he's just a fascinating human being. And again, I think he's one of the best in the league, and he does it in his own Brock Purdy way. And I've said for over a year, let Brock cook. Like, let him, give him a play, let him figure it out, and he will figure it out. He's got a special mind that can figure stuff out.
So you don't come out of that game against the Packers concerned at all? This has nothing to do with Debo's. Has nothing to do with Debo's health.
Because there were so many passes that you're like, what? Like, it was a confusing watch, and it was an unnerving watch, because of the first time you thought, well, wait, hold on. I thought he was Superman in his own way, and all of a sudden there's just weird stuff happening. Balls coming out. They weren't even close. And then you got thinking about, he's wiping his hand as he's dropping back. Like, is there a rain thing? Is there because we're getting to know him. We don't know him. And is there somehow wet ball? Some guy just look. There's guys I play with just didn't like the wet ball. And who loves it? Nobody. But then you got thinking, well, is that the kryptonite? And then then also just they've been off for 3 weeks. I mean, Brock had not played in 21 days. That's an eternity. That's a hard restart for a quarterback, I believe, to be gone off of that competitive edge that you have to have week to week. So anyway, there's a lot of things to try to explain it, but it was unnerving, and the 49ers were beat. I think they sensed it. There's a huge sigh. I don't know how you can make huge bigger than huge, but like a massive, huge, enormous nuclear sigh of relief that happened when they got that last drive done, because if that would have ended right there with that talent and all the people they put together, that would have been somewhat criminal.
All right, there is Steve Young with Rich Eisen, and so much of what Steve said there, I really agree with. Let's go through it a little bit. One, he talks about Purdy and he compares him to a guy like Cousins, and he just talks about the efficiency. And at one point, Steve says, maybe Brock's the most efficient quarterback ever. And when you look at him, the one thing is what Brock did this year on the football field was real. It wasn't make believe. It wasn't, it wasn't like his own category of it. And it's a 4-quarter NFL game with real players and real, defenses, and everything that he did is real. There's nothing that in any way wasn't real. The efficiency is what is the trait that stands out, though, about Brock Purdy. That he has a high completion percentage and yet leads the NFL in yards per attempt and has the best quarterback rating and some of the best efficiency numbers in the entire league that we've seen in a number of years. And Steve says, he's a fascinating human being. He basically said he's a special person, and there's no question he is very unique. And he's had this unbelievable impact. Now, how much of it is Brock? How much of it is the innovative mind of Kyle Shanahan? How much of it is reliant on these weapons? He seems to struggle if you take away a Deebo Samuel. But it's like, one of the things that's really interesting, and Steve said it, I mean, watching the Green Bay game was a little confusing. I mean, it was. Steve called it a confusing watch and a little bit of an unnerving watch, and asked the question, was it simply a rain thing? Did it have to do with the 21 days off? Brock Purdy was sitting around for 21 days. Or is it just that the wet ball is his kryptonite? Is it possible that he just cannot handle the wet ball? He made a number of questionable throws when it rained in the second quarter earlier this year in Cleveland. And yet when the conditions kind of dried up a little bit towards the end of that game, he led a nice, efficient drive down the field and hit Brandon Ayuk a couple times, got into field goal range, only to see Jake Moody miss a 41-yard field goal. In this game against Green Bay, his ball placement was off. He was high. He was low. His timing was a little off. He was early. He was late. He threw a ball that Darnell Savage, for all intents and purposes, should have taken back for a pick six. So who is he? What is he? How much do how much of it's him? How much of it is the scheme? How much is the surrounding cast? Steve himself predicted that there would be a problem with the 21 days off. That's too much time. That, the whole rest versus rust debate, that the being off from live football for 21 days means that there's going to be a rustiness to your game when you get back. And there's no question that Brock was not in great rhythm in this game. It wasn't just the wet football. To me, it was the footwork. His feet seemed planted at the top of his drop. He seemed a little off as far as his rhythm, his footwork. He didn't seem like he had that kind of bounciness to him. He seemed like he was rigid. And, Steve said it. He said when the Niners, led that final drive down the field and they won the game, it was a massive sigh of relief. So there's no question. There was a lot of pressure there. And, the 49ers had to do two things in that game. They had to somehow interrupt Jordan Love's amazing rhythm, because he was in great rhythm coming out of Dallas. And despite sitting out for 3 weeks, they needed to, have Brock Purdy find an offensive rhythm. And I thought it was going to be super challenging to take Jordan Love out of rhythm, and not that challenging to establish Brock Purdy, establish his own rhythm, because I just figured Green Bay's defense was good, but not super great. That they would run the ball a lot, that they would then be able to play action pass off of it, and that Brock, after maybe a series or two, would find his rhythm. But he never really seemed to find it in the first half. But then, fourth quarter, game's on the line, still operating with a wet ball on a wet field. It wasn't a disaster monsoon, but he went almost 7 for 7 with 2 key running plays and marched the 49ers down the field with all the pressure that went along with it. And it ultimately resulted in the game-winning touchdown. And if George Kittle catches a ball that Brock Purdy puts right on his hands, Brock Purdy's perfect on that final drive. 7 for 7 with 2 rushing plays. So, I don't know. I'm not sure exactly what to say about it. To me, if you said, is Brock Purdy Mahomes? No, he's not Mahomes. Mahomes has got a bigger arm. Josh Allen has a bigger arm. Lamar Jackson's almost in his own category as a runner. He's a tremendous runner. I guess what I would see is, there have been a few quarterbacks who were just very, very efficient and very, very competitive and winners. And I would put like Joe in that category. And I would put Brady in that category. I also probably would put Drew Brees in that category. And there's elements of Brock's game that remind me of Joe. There's elements of Brock's game that remind me of Brees. There's elements of Brock's game that remind me of Russell Wilson. If you think of one of the greatest quarterbacks in the history of the NFL, Fran Tarkenton. Fran Tarkenton was about 6 feet, kind of narrow shoulders, ran figure eights, was hard to sack, had incredible movement ability. Is it possible that Brock Purdy could be kind of a 2024 version of what Fran Tarkenton was with the Giants and Vikings? That's kind of what I see. I see a guy who's got, what's Brock's greatest trait? I think it's his processing in his brain is 1. His competitiveness is 2. And I think that his processing and his brain and his competitiveness are such elite traits that it helps him play at a very high level, despite maybe not having the elite physical traits of a Lamar, of a Josh Allen, of a Patrick Mahomes. He's even, and it's almost as if, in some ways, Fran Tarkenton didn't ever get the respect that he probably deserved for the stats that he put up because he didn't win the Super Bowl. He got in there against, the Steel Curtain, and he lost to Mean Joe Green and L.C. Greenwood and the boys. And if he had won Super Bowls, I think he would have been held in a higher regard. Joe Montana did break through and win Super Bowls, and he's like in his own special category. I see a lot of Montana in Brock in that Montana was insanely competitive and could block out bad things that happened earlier in the game and just focus on being a competitor and doing everything that he had to do to play great when it mattered most. Joe Montana and the 49ers turned it over 6 times in Joe's most famous NFC Championship game win over the Dallas Cowboys, but it still didn't deter him from being awesome on that final drive and finding Dwight Clark in the corner of the end zone. I see a lot of Drew Brees. When I talk to Willie Snead about Brock Purdy, Willie Snead played with Drew Brees, and he's now on this Niner team as a wide receiver, and he's caught passes from Drew Brees, and he's caught passes from Brock Purdy, and I talked to Willie about it, and he's like, yeah, Brock Purdy reminds me a lot of Drew Brees. When I watch Brock Purdy run around out there and the way he's competitive and has great escapability, he reminds me a little bit of Russell Wilson. And I don't think it's accidental that, Russell Wilson owned the Niners. And as soon as Russell Wilson wasn't there and Brock Purdy's on this side, now Brock Purdy and the Niners are owning Seattle. Because Russell was efficient. Russell was competitive. Russell was smart. Now, Russell had huge hands, 10.5-inch hands. Purdy's hands are smaller, but they're not small. He's got the same size hands as Patrick Mahomes. He doesn't have tiny hands. So that's the fact that he would struggle with a wet football is a little bit of a mystery. And I agree with Steve. It was a little confusing watching the Green Bay game, and it was a little unnerving. Is it possible that Steve was right going into that game, that Brock was going to be out of rhythm, and it took him 3.5 quarters to find that rhythm? Or is it possible that Brock's game and the real strength of his game is his competitive fire, and it wasn't until that final drive where it was just like, hey, man, the one thing about Brock Purdy, he's resilient. When he has played bad against Baltimore, he came back with a lot of great throws. When he, had played bad against Cleveland earlier this year, didn't look good. The wet football's bothering him. He's kind of spraying it. His accuracy wasn't good in the second quarter. Yeah, but what did he do in the fourth quarter? He led them from their own 25 or 28 or whatever it was down the field and into field goal range, and could have came away with the game winner if the rookie kicker makes the kick. So, to me, if you're asking me, first of all, I love Steve going on with Rich Eisen and just kind of openly talking about what he sees. And he doesn't claim to have all the answers. He's very candid in what he says and how he sees it. But I agree with him. It was a confusing watch. It was a little bit unnerving. It is possible that a wet football is his kryptonite. It may have been the 21 days off. I mean, Steve's not the I told you so guy, but he easily could have said to Rich Eisen, hey, you know what? I said 3 weeks ago that, 3 weeks off is too much. And here it was. It looked like it was too much. But he's not that kind of a guy. He's not the I told you so kind of a guy. But it is interesting. I mean, Brock doesn't have the play style or the arm strength of a Mahomes or a Josh Allen. He doesn't have the mobility and the speed of Lamar Jackson. But, Drew Brees won a ring. Russell Wilson has a Super Bowl ring. Fran Tarkenton played in the Super Bowl. Is it possible that Brock Purdy is kind of in that category? And it could be possible that the wet ball is his kryptonite. It could be that a wet football really bothers him, that he hasn't really had enough experience using a glove or operating with a wet football, and so he doesn't really have a plan of attack, and he's just trying to kind of get through it. But when the rain kind of subsided in Cleveland in the fourth quarter, man, he sure led the Niners down the field. And when the money was on the table and the season was hanging in the balance, man, he almost went 7 for 7, and the 49ers beat Green Bay. So, interesting player. As Steve said, fascinating human being, a special person for sure. And he doesn't have the Mahomes or Allen arm strength. And there's only one Lamar as a runner. But when I see Brock, I see a little bit of Joe, a little bit of Breeze, a little bit of Russell, a little bit of Fran Tarkenton, for some of you older fans that remember Fran running around out there. And I see a guy that ultimately, Fran Tarkenton never really got his respect. Drew Brees and Russell Wilson got a little because they won one. Joe Montana obviously did get the respect because he won 3 and then went to Kansas City and got them to the brink of winning a Super Bowl. And there was some real magic about Joe. A little bit similar to Brock. When he's playing well, his efficiency, he plays on time, the accuracy, the brain, the competitive fire, the coolness under pressure, the calmness. Brent Jones played with Joe Montana and claims that Brock Purdy reminds him of Joe. So it's not just me saying it. Brent said it. Brent caught passes from Joe and is watching Brock Purdy now. So if you said to me, make sense of Brock Purdy, I don't know. I'm not sure. I know he's damn good. I know what he's done is for real. I know his arm is not elite, and it appears that a wet football really bothers him, and he's never going to have the skill set of Josh Allen or Patrick Mahomes, and he's never going to have the speed of Lamar Jackson. But if he wins the ultimate game, the Super Bowl, he will get the respect that I'm sure he covets, and I'm sure all Niner fans want for him. Breeze climbed the mountaintop once and got it done. Not the biggest guy, 6 feet, 6'1". A lot of heart, great release, very accurate. Ball came out on time. Russell Wilson, a little bit more of a scrambler, maybe a little bit more of a better deep ball thrower, but also Brock throws the deep ball with great accuracy as well, and he can put it on your hands. He reminds me a lot of Russell. He reminds me a little bit of Tarkenton. To me, he's kind of got the frame of Fran Tarkenton, the kind of the competitive fire / movement ability of Russell Wilson and Joe, and a little bit of the the ability to kind of have confidence and lead and throw a very catchable pass, kind of like a Drew Brees. Once again, Willie Snead says he's Drew Brees. He reminds him of Drew Brees. If there's one guy he reminds me of, it's kind of Russell Wilson with the kind of frame of Fran Tarkenton. I'll say this. Brock Purdy is a damn good quarterback, and there's nothing accidental about it. And people who want to sit there and try to make it seem like it's all luck or it's accidental or the clock's going to strike midnight and suddenly he's going to be some bum. No. What you see is real. His processing, his mental capacity, his competitive fire, his accuracy, but his footwork kind of went away against Green Bay, and he's kind of a rhythm player. And as Steve kind of warned us, 21 days off will impact your rhythm. I think that's what we're seeing. That's what we're watching. We're watching a fascinating player that's unlike many other players. It's making football fans and football media kind of, simultaneously question him. And yet you can kind of hear everybody. The one thing that comes out in everybody's tone is like, this guy's different. Yeah, you didn't hear Ryan Clark say he's garbage. He's a dime a dozen now because he knows he's good. The ball comes out on time and with accuracy. And there's no question he's a great competitor. He's got that. He's got a lot of the same, traits. I've talked to Joe Montana. I've interviewed Tom Brady. I've talked to Drew Brees. I've interviewed Kirk Cousins. He's got a lot of those same, great humility, great perspective, mental maturity, competitive fire, chip on his shoulder, You know, a lot of the traits that those guys have, this guy has. Very interesting stuff. Hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks to Pig and a Pickle for being the title sponsor of the Krug Show. Thanks to Underdog Fantasy for sponsoring this video. Thanks to all you guys for supporting the Krug Show on YouTube.